thank you all for being here today. We are moving forward with today's Mission Control webinar, Are Your Tests on Track? I am Andria Brown. I am the Chief Marketing Officer at Certiverse, and we have a couple panelists that I will be introducing shortly. But just as we get started, this webinar series is presented by Certiverse. We are an end-to-end exam development and delivery platform. If you are not familiar, we use our award-winning technology to make every step of creating and administering a rigorous valid exam easier, with the goal of getting you from concept to candidate in a matter of weeks. And of course, we'd be happy to talk to you more about that, but that is not the core and focus of our discussion today. We have a brief amount of time and a lot of interesting things to talk about. So if you do have questions as we are going along, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A section. You can choose to post them to the group or just to the panelists if you would prefer to be anonymous as you ask a question. And we will, if we have a chance to talk about them as we go, we will, or we can get to them at the end as well. So if you think of something and want to talk about as we get to the end, we'll leave some time for that as well. So with that, let's get started. And Abby, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm Attieh. I am Vice President of Certification here at Certiverse. I've been in the industry about 20 years, a little bit over 20 years. I've worked on both sides of the fence, both on the vendor side and on the client side, with many different certification programs. So happy to hear Randy's expertise today. So I'll be asking some questions as well. Randy?
Hi, everyone. I'm Randy Russell. I am the Director of Certification at Red Hat. And, we have been working with Certiverse for a while. And, hopefully I might be able to share some insights people find useful.
Great. All right. And as mentioned, I'm the Chief Marketing Officer. My role today really will be just to sort of moderate the discussion and keep things moving forward and keeping an eye on your questions. So to get started with our first question, really, we just kind of wanted to start with a little bit of background of Red Hat certification programs. So if we could kind of discuss a little bit about kind of the purpose and status of your programs as you came to making some changes with those, and what was your initial impetus for evaluating whether your programs might benefit from performing job task analysis.
Right. So Red Hat is a software company. We are global. We are actually now a wholly owned and independent subsidiary of IBM. They acquired us, I guess, in 2018, if memory serves correctly. We've had a certification program for 25 years, and not entirely coincidentally, I've been with Red Hat for 25 years. I think we have at least one attendee who's been through the program. See, I'm paying attention. So we have a certification program. It is very specifically focused on using our software, and it is for technical professionals. And so, the roles that we are going to certify in are typically things that are in the system administrator space or the application developer space, or things that are sort of adjacent to those kinds of roles. The list of potential roles is long, but they tend to fit into those categories. These are technical certifications. They are very much focused on being able to use the software as part of an IT organization for production purposes. And to that end, we are, I don't want to say entirely unique in the industry, but we have had a very strong focus from the beginning on performance-based testing. That has been our focus over the years. We are 100% performance-based testing, and all of the exams in our catalog, every single one of them is a performance-based exam. And so, the rest of the world has kind of come around to the value of this, and I think a lot of programs now have some elements of that, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think we probably do more of this performance-based testing, both in terms of our catalog and the percentage of what we do as performance testing than probably anybody out there. So that's who the program is. What is our impetus for for JTAs? Well, we're in kind of a, again, somewhat different circumstance than a lot of programs. It's very often the case that when somebody is brought in to start or continue a certification program at an IT vendor, they are typically somebody who comes from an educational background, both in terms of their formal education and training and so on, and that is their specialty. And a job task analysis is part of the skills and knowledge that they bring in, and they might not necessarily be particularly fluent or expert in the subject matter that they are trying to create a certification and presumably assessments for, but they bring in their subject matter experts, their SMEs, and they have a process for doing that, and JTAs are very central to that. I mention all of that, which might be a statement of the obvious, because we're a bit different than that. Our team consists of practitioners, people who have worked with these technologies in the field, who continue to work with these technologies in the field. And in that sense, we're a bit more like a medieval craft guild. That if you wanted to become a master cobbler back in the olden days, well, you had to produce a pair of beautiful shoes that were your masterwork, that the guild would go, okay, you're one of us. After doing your apprenticeship and being a journeyman and all those things, that's how you got there. And I mention that because that's very much in the character of sort of how we test, and it will have some impacts as we talk about our use of Certiverse. We do test by doing. We do have people actually perform system administration or application development tasks, and we evaluate them on whether they made stuff work or not. And so, that's kind of how we work in the program. And so, do you want me to launch into the impetus, or do you have some follow up?
No, I think that would be great if you tell us, what made you think that maybe you wanted to reevaluate your program, and then also what led you to think, well, maybe JTA is the next step.
Well, so the thing is that there are pretty well established best practices in the industry.
Hmm.
And so while I feel like we have built an effective program, you know, and no apologies for sometimes taking a different approach on this, it is the case that I look at those best practices and I say, well, a job task analysis really does exist for a reason. And even if we are, as I say, practitioners, we know the tech, it's still the case that we come from a particular perspective, or perspectives, and particular ways of using it. And, one of the fundamental reasons why JTAs are used in the industry is that they provide a broader range of perspectives, that you're more likely to, you know, get the news that you're missing something important, or possibly that there's something that you've included that really isn't that important, right? And so I've had that sense of it being something useful to do, but the overhead, first of all, of the traditional JTA, where you're going to herd a bunch of SMEs into a room for a week and have this facilitated exercise synchronously in person. I'm just going to say that's not likely to happen. We've done it, but it's just about impossible, right? Even thinking about sort of our COVID and post-COVID world, just to get something on everyone's calendar that is the same time and that you get all those hours of synchronous time, it's just a degree of administrative overhead that is not going to happen. And so, when I first spoke to Ruben Garcia, your CEO, about Certiverse, the light goes off, and I'm like, yes, this is exactly the thing that's going to allow us to undertake this best practice, but do it in a way that is actually realistic for us, because the big facilitated everybody flying in thing, that was never going to happen.
Yeah.
But an asynchronous, online tool facilitated approach, okay, that starts to seem like something that's realistic, and that's really where this started for us.
And do you think, how much does the quickness or the rate of change in exam content play into that. So is that a reason possibly why before you also couldn't do that? Or is that not a
There is
factor with you?
there is an element of that as well. So, we have at this point, having been around for a while and so on, we have products that have longer release cycles and
Hmm.
very predictable release dates. And, what comes out on day zero is well known by then after, sort of a long public beta process. We also have other products that are not that, that tend to be more leading edge, and that do tend to evolve faster. And even our, long-standing products that have that longer lifetime, earlier in their, product lifetimes, they were more like that. If you think
Hmm.
about having a major release every 6 months, that's that's kind of a big deal. And we're going to change more, for example, as, a software company than what are best practices in US public accounting, right? Which is not to say that they don't evolve or change. They're driven by, regulations and legislation and so on. But on a 6 month basis, other than those kinds of things, what is best practice for a CPA is going to be relatively stable. Whereas for us, especially with some of the perhaps more app development focused things that we have, the world can just change in a 6 month period. And so there is that need to be able to adjust to change and adjust, in a lightweight and quick sort of way. That doesn't mean you're putting all your eggs in a basket and then you're just putting the basket aside for 3 to 5 years, right?
That's right. Yeah, very
Right.
good.
Well, let's move a little bit into, how that change to your program was received, or what how it was justified, reacted to. Did you have any concerns or pushback from, other folks in the team or higher up in the company about adding these new steps? I mean, it seems like when you are going to say we're going to do this new thing, there's always going to be a little hesitation about the change or the cost or the complication.
Well, yeah. So we're going to do this new thing. If it's something that requires opening someone's wallet, it's going to be may we do this, not this new thing. I don't get to declare it unilaterally as much as I would love to. So the first thing is that it did require a degree of internal education above, because it happened that I had brought this forward once before, and it was just not seen as a priority at the time. And then before we brought this on, we actually had a reorganization within the company, and my team, the certification team, found itself in another part of the company, and in a part of the company that isn't necessarily deeply versed in learning and certification, right? And so it required a bit of, you know, tutelage about, well, why would we do this and why is this an advantage? Because, the question that might come up is, so couldn't you just do this like in a Google sheet? Well, in theory, maybe I could, but I don't think we'd be happy with the results. And I think it would require, 100 times more time and effort to make that actually work. And your Google Sheet can always be copied. And so you end up with, 10 JTAs with potentially conflicting information. So no, you can't do it that way. And, this was seen as, I was able to present this as sort of a unique offering in the market that would be beneficial. Within the certification team, I'm proud to say that we are generally receptive to doing new things, and there was an understanding of the role that this would play. Yes, it meant some additional overhead and effort, but the way I pitched this to my managers, who I have a couple of managers who manage development teams, is we're going to ease into this. We're going to start this as a pilot. This is not going to be a boil the ocean, everything changes on day zero. It's let's bring this in, let's ease into using it, and see where we end up. And that's the approach we've taken, and that has helped with any sort of resistance there might have been from the people I threw into it, is that we're gonna ease into the pool, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the last sort of thing in terms of concerns or pushback is that really our goal is that this is something that doesn't simply inform our work, in exam development, but that it also informs the work that our colleagues who do curriculum development that is aligned to our program, that they would also benefit from this. And so one of the things that, as we have been evangelizing this to a wider audience, is to make it clear to them that this will do a lot and it will give us a very well vetted common ground to start from. It's not going to write your course for you. It's not intended to be that. It is intended for blueprinting and item writing, and we're going to find it useful for the blueprinting piece. You're going to have to do additional work beyond that, but you're going to start from the same very well vetted blueprint that we will have, and it's still going to be useful to you. So there's, again, I think a certain amount of education and explanation about why this would be a worthwhile thing to do.
That's really interesting because it sounds like instead of waiting for pushback or asking, I mean, I know you said you do have to, do a little bit of asking for permission, but instead of waiting for that pushback, it almost seems like you started with education first. So whether it's educating up or educating out to your team, it's talking about, well, for things like a JTA,
Mhm.
why is this a best practice in the industry, and how can this benefit our program instead of waiting for that pushback? That's a really interesting and really great way to go about it too, to avoid so much pushback right away.
Well, here's another dimension that I'll share on this, is that uh, this, our adoption of Certiverse and my pitching it happened right in the middle of a time when Red Hat was taking a renewed and very committed focus to having, its technical associates getting Red Hat certified and actually earning some other certs that are, adjacent to what we do. This had become a focus in our services organization, meaning our consultants, our technical account managers, our folks in technical sales, and so on. Is that there was a sense that we really want to, because we've long had requirements in various ways for people in these different roles to be certified, but that perhaps we had not been as strict in recent years as we once were, especially given a lot of hiring that had happened, let's say, in the last 4 years or so. And so there was this return to, a commitment to certification. And with that return and people being told, hey, you're going to be required to get certified by date, go figure, people who are maybe struggling with that, their struggles were not necessarily because they needed to work harder and learn more and understand
Mhm.
more. It had to be because we were doing the wrong thing, right? And so one of the things that I was able to put forward is, look, I don't think we're doing the wrong thing, but how useful would it be internally when there starts to be, firing up on a mailing list, people unhappy because they're not passing or whatever? How useful would it be for us to be able to say, look, what we cover is not what we're just thinking, making up out of our own heads, but it's really what, a cross section of SMEs, including people in these roles that are now being, put under the gun to get certified, that having that input initially is going to give us a lot of cover that we would not necessarily have if we didn't have that kind of JTA process. Now, interestingly, we don't get a lot of that kind of feedback from outside of Red Hat, and that vast majority of people who come to us through, as customers or partners. But internally, there was a bit of heat, and
Yeah.
I saw this as something that would, settle people's uncertainties about it. And look, if maybe we are getting it wrong in theory, don't think we are, but in theory, this is also the thing that would point us on a better path forward. And after we come out with an exam, if there's people who feel it's whatever, that's always an invitation to say, well, would you like to participate in the future? So strangely, I would say a big impetus and one of the selling things is that I think it actually helps us in our internal political landscape to be doing something like this.
Data doesn't lie, right?
Data doesn't lie. Well, and it's data doesn't lie, and it's data that's collected without saying, oh, well, we need to have these people from your team, and we need them for a week, and we need you to spend your travel budget, and they're going to be 100% focused on this for the week. So forget about having them go visit a client who you're trying to sell to, or a client that you have a services engagement for.
Yeah.
A lot easier to say, look, yeah, you're going to contribute, and it's not going to be that.
So what was the outcome then? To this next question, did the addition of JTAs lead your organization to any major changes that you had to make in the exams, or did they really just validate, like you said previously, that you are doing the right things, but now you have the data to back that up?
Yeah. So no, it hasn't resulted in major changes, nor was I expecting it to. We would have been accepting of it if it did, and it remains to be seen going forward whether we might discover one exam among the several dozen that we have that it's like, oh, okay, maybe we did miss the boat. But thus far, no, that's not been the case. It wasn't expected. Has it brought incremental improvement? I think it has. And has it also accomplished that more sort of diplomatic outreach goal? Absolutely, it has. It has helped us in that respect, and it has given us insight into you know some perspectives that we might not have had otherwise. It's
I
also
know.
helped us with one exam in which, just as I said, we're practitioners, but it's an area in which we're not as deep. Okay, and so it allowed us to bring in some people who are deeper in some of these areas than we were, and so it's worked very well in that respect. Major changes, no. Incremental, absolutely.
And then that's, it's almost like you can't complain if you don't vote. And so it's almost like if your SMEs give input, you can say, look, these are your peers that helped do this. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and it also fits very well culturally with Red Hat because the thing that we are most known for is that we're an open source software company, and the premise of open source is openness. It's transparency and visibility. Now, exam programs are still exam programs, and there's still a need for some degree of confidentiality, and there's some of these practices like that apply to us same as anybody else. But there is that desire within the company, because it is so core to our culture and our raison d'etre, if you will, that being able to have a participatory dimension to our process plays very well. That it fits with what we do, because it is literally what we do. That is the market in which we work. It's the products we sell, and being able to have that sort of wider umbrella, encompassing more views, and a mechanism for saying, hey, you've got opinions, we want those opinions, here's a mechanism for providing them. I think it's worked very well in that respect.
Fantastic. And I will say this last one is our last seated question. So we will take the rest of the time with this one unless we see some questions come in the Q&A. So if you do have any follow-ups or any questions about what we've discussed so far, please throw those into the chat. Otherwise, we will talk about what outcomes you saw once those exams were live. So you've mentioned that it did not, make massive changes, but I also know that you have, made a decision to make this a broader, go beyond a pilot stage and implement it for the program at large. So what were the reasons, behind that decision, and what do you hope to get out of making that a longer term decision?
Well, I would still say we are relatively new in the process. We have several exams that have now been through the process. And I think it's going to take a little bit of time for us to get a sense, sort of a bit of A/B testing, if you will, or, a control group and the ones that actually get the test drug. to see sort of, is this giving us measurable difference in how this works? And I think it's a little early for us to make declarations on that. For me, from a process perspective, I do see advantage here because it is one of those things that I can go and look in Certiverse and I can see, how the thinking is emerging around a particular exam or another, right? Is I can see what some of that input is. I can see, some of the commentary. And then I think, again, there's just the sort of that diplomatic piece is that there's not just the people that we have participating directly in sort of that core JTA exercise. But then the survey aspect that you can follow up with is a really nice piece that, again, gives us a much wider bit of input, more opportunity, and we can hit, mailing lists for all these different constituencies that we want to get feedback from. And again, it gives us a visible way to say, look, we're listening. We want to hear what you think, and then act upon that. So I think we're going to need a little more time to get a sense of it. But for me, I see a lot of positive things from a process perspective. And I think the outcomes we'll have to see probably in a bit more time.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we will give it one more minute unless there's any questions that are coming up. I'm not seeing. Abby, do you see anything in
Nope,
the
I'm not
chat?
seeing
Okay,
any questions.
Gotcha. Making sure. Oh. Okay, gotcha. All right. Okay. Well, thank you for those. Appreciate the compelling success story commentary. That is appreciated.
Yeah.
I will add too, if any part of the content threw you off as far as JTA processes or that's not something you're currently using or have more questions about, you can check out the Certiverse YouTube channel. We do have several previous webinars on job task analysis, on the reasons for doing them, the process involved in that. So it's a little background information you can get on that, and we'll have those resources on our website as well. And if you'd like to talk more to anybody that was on this session, you can find us on LinkedIn. Answers@certiverse.com will also get you to us as well. So thank you so much, Randy and Abby, for joining us today. And hopefully we will see the rest of you at our next webinar, which will be May 16th. And be sure to spread the word. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.